Wonderful conference, and let me just launch in. The handout is not everything I'll be talking about. I had given this talk somewhere else, and this was useful, and I thought I'd pass it on to you if the organizers thought it was helpful too. All the world's a stage. So begins the famous monologue in Act 2, Scene 7 of Shakespeare's comic As You Like It. The speech continues. And all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Shakespeare speaks here as a lifespan developmental psychologist, where the script and the staging are largely determined by the natural psychobiology of Homo sapiens. The acts of the play of life involve 7 stages of man, which start with the infant mewing and puking in the nurse's arms, work through adolescence, mature adulthood, and culminate in coming full circle to second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Shakespeare's idea, and that of Greek playwrights and the Roman philosopher Seneca long before him, was that there is an analogy between living a life and the performance of a stage actor who follows a script, of the stages of life as analogous to the different acts of a play, and of the performance of life as structured by the age, range, and skill of the actor, and by audience response, which taken together determine whether the life is comic, tragic, some of each, or something in between. There are weak and strong forms of the idea that life is a performance. Some lives are like performances in certain respects. All lives are like performances in certain respects. Modern lives and or the lives of the well-off have more performative possibilities than ancient or poor lives. Human life is just a performance, and so on. And there are descriptive and normative views. Lives are like or are performances, and it would be good if lives were less or more performative, self-creative, original, and so on. If the stage play was the preferred analogy in the West for the performative conception until the 17th century, contemporary analogies of a life with an art form include poetry, painting, autobiography, and the novel. And some of the early quotes on the handout are in this direction, and I will read them. So my topic today is this question of, can we, and should we, conceive of life as conceptualized, scripted, directed, and acted by the person whose life it is. Now, these involve different components, and we could go weaker or stronger. But one possibility of what I'll call just a very strong industrial strength performative conception is that you are in charge of the whole thing. Okay, you're the stage director, you're the scripter, and you're the actor, and all that, and you're the audience. I mean, we could go as radical as you want, and these views are out there. So then if so, we might wonder what kind of planning, scripting, conceptualizing, and so on ought the person to do for his or her life. And in fact, I do discuss improvisation in my paper ever so briefly. But some of the possibilities here are, of course, something like having a life plan or a blueprint for your life. Now, when the heck this could start, but imagine that there's something like an age of reason, and at the point you reach the age of reason, an agent ought to have something like a life plan, a blueprint. Then there's a sort of a lesser model, which would be like 5-year plan model, okay? Or 3-year plans or 2, like universities operate on, or they used to. And then there's the improv model, okay? It's just, you just do it as it comes, and you're doing improvisation. Now these are all ways, since improv, exactly as we just heard, is a way of performing. This is a possibility, as is Wagner figuring out operatic series for Will Go Forever. So there's 2 sets of questions here. One is a set of metaphysical and logical questions that I actually am interested in, namely, how is it possible that you could be this kind of performer? And David Velleman has a nice quote on the paper, which is that, Velleman's asked this, many philosophers, he says, have thought that human autonomy includes, or perhaps even consists in, a capacity for self-constitution, a capacity that is to define or invent or create oneself. Unfortunately, self-constitution sounds not just magical but paradoxical, as if the rabbit could go solo and pull himself out of the hat. So that's the vicinity of the metaphysical and logical problems. Today, though, I want to talk about and defend myself from the view that I called Alexander Nehamas a selfish creep. No. I want to talk about the normative aspects of conceiving of life in these along these performative lines. I have no deep thoughts about them. I just have thoughts about this, and I'm actually attracted to the idea that we ought to think, or I like to think of life along these performative, self-fashioned lines. But there are problems and perplexities. So let me say, so I'm going to devote my talk now to the issues of the norms. And to talk about the norms, I want to orient ourselves to three texts. I'll kind of take these texts as crucial for, at least inside my team, among philosophers, the way we sometimes conceive about good human lives, or the norms of living a good human life. The first text, the sort of locus classicus, is a Platonic text. And at the beginning of my paper, I talk about an idea which I call Platonic hedonism, but that's an odd thing to go with Plato. Better maybe to call it something like Platonic unity, or the Platonic, maybe having read Elijah's paper, I should call it subplatonic. But it's roughly this idea that there's something about being a person, possibly just being my kind of person, I don't know, that makes attractive three goals: the true, the good, and the beautiful. Like, the kind of impulse here is something like, and Thomas was talking about, the impulse is just to say something like, it's nice to know about things, to be able to detect reality beneath the appearances when you can. It's nice to, it's good to discover nature. It's good to know the truth rather than the false. That's on the side of the truth. So it's an epistemic norm, an epistemic ideal. There's the good. It's better to live a good life and be oriented towards what is good rather than what is bad. So to have good human relations rather than bad human relations. Non-instrumental human relations rather than purely instrumental human relations. And it's also good, thirdly, to live in the vicinity of what's beautiful. Physical beauty, natural beauty, social beauty, and so on and so forth. This is just the idea that we're the kind of animals, there's nothing supernaturalistic about this, we're the kind of animals that have this, what I sometimes call Platonic orientation towards what's good and what's true and beautiful. Now you see how this, if I'm right about this, then you might say something like this: therefore it might be the case that a good human life might sensibly aspire to live in the space where those three things coincide. And therefore, if you're going to perform a life, or construct a life, or script a life, then you might want it to be a life that seeks to live at the intersection of what's good, what's true, and what's beautiful. Now this will mean certain things about self-narration, self-performance, and how to live a life. The second text is by Aristotle, Plato's student, and this occurs in Nicomachean Ethics mostly, but that's where Aristotle talks about a good human life having to be evaluated as a whole. Okay? Now this doesn't necessarily mean he's in favor of unity, but the idea is kind of that a good life is a life of activity in accordance with virtue, is what he says. Okay? Reason and virtue, this both, again, the Platonic epistemic and moral norms seem to be figuring in here. And one of the really fascinating things to me that Aristotle says is, he says, you might think that you could tell whether or not a person had lived a good human life, as it were, if you were an omniscient eulogist. Okay, so the person dies, and you happen to know everything about it, and then you give the eulogy, and you say, he or she was eudemon. I pronounce it like it's French word, I'm sorry. It just means flourishing, something like flourishing or fulfilled. So you say, but Aristotle then pauses in early in the Nicomachean Ethics. He says, but no, we should take seriously what Solon says, which is that you can't tell whether a person flourished until you see how the grandchildren turn out. Now that's interesting because it means that human flourishing doesn't just have to do with your subjective states, because you're dead, okay? But something about that, this was something Alexander said yesterday, about thinking of persons as events rather than things. And if we think of persons as events, okay, then the performance, as you might say, isn't over when the curtain closes, it actually continues on via its effects. I think Aristotle, he hems and haws about this. He says sometimes, he says, well, I really shouldn't say this because it seems unfair to people to say that the quality of their life depends on the effects that they leave. On the other hand, we do it all the time. So I think this is just a thought, and I think it's compelling. And the third text is just John Locke's text, which at least among philosophers we say, Locke is the person who articulates perfectly the modern consensus, or he begins the modern consensus, that personhood involves, in some important sense, what Dan Schachter talked about yesterday and what Wilson was talking about this morning, memorial connections to oneself. Okay? The idea that the person I am is in some way the person who I remember myself as being and appropriate to myself now. So this is sometimes called the consciousness or the memory criteria. Now Locke is sensitive actually to, even though he didn't know any cognitive neuroscience or anything, he's sensitive to the fact that memory, we have false memories. And within the structure of the Lockean universe, he has a solution: God. So here's the deal. You have a certain narrative self-representation that you have of yourself, and it's bound to be, there's going to be forgetfulnesses, there's going to be self-serving spinnings of your actions. You're going to have action descriptions which are completely self-serving. He's aware of this. You'll have some forgettings. And you get to heaven, so this quote is on your sheet after Locke's definition of personhood. He says, as the Bible tells us, on Judgment Day, God will restore to you all your memories correctly. Okay? So this is a very interesting sort of intellectual prop. The idea is that there is actually a true description of who you are, what you've done, why you've done it. So the gentleman earlier today was asking sort of what about, what does neuroscience deliver to this? Well, we have many traditions. I mean, spiritual traditions are the main one, where if you have an omniscient God, he can call you to account for what really happened. Now, here's the problem I think that we face in modernity. What I call the metaphysical teleological structure of the Lockean universe is cut out from under us. We don't think that there is some omniscient being who actually knows what I call, in some of my earlier work, our actual full identity. Okay, so you might say there's two levels here in the Lockean view. One is my remembered self, my self-represented identity, and then there's my actual full identity. That's really the story from God's point of view. Now we think, historically we've thought, that God speaks in accordance with kind of our language theory just spiffed up in the way that an omniscient being could. But it's entirely possible, and you get this sometimes in sort of some of the questions that have been coming up. I mean, some people, like one of my colleagues, thinks that neuroscience isn't nearly at the right level of analysis. It'll be much lower than that. It'll be, the correct description of your actions will be from the level of bosons and fermions and their constellations, how they come together. Okay? If you start to go this direction, that there's an actual correct description of things, you might just think it's at the lowest level. Okay? That persons are just complex patterns of bosons and fermions coming together. So, but nonetheless, in our picture, God is, at least on the Lockean view of things, God has these norms there for you, and they are, now notice, going back to the Platonic orientation, I said that for Plato, there's three things you ought to be doing with your life. You ought to be oriented towards what's true, what's good, and what's beautiful. I think by the time we get to Locke, there's only one main thing you ought to be doing. That's the moral. Okay? I think the God of John Locke cares much less about aesthetic perfection and much less about intellectual perfection, or the epistemic and the aesthetic. It's your moral qualities that you'll be judged by on Judgment Day, not on those other things. But I think it's important for us to recognize these are the ideas that are in play. Okay, so our modern predicament is, well, what are the norms, given that some of the traditional norms are no longer there? We no longer think that there's a metaphysical teleological structure to the universe that tells us exactly how we're supposed to live our lives. And here, I just want to go through, I would turn to, if you have a handout, I don't know if everybody does. Here's some sort of ways I think that people, at least this person, I shouldn't say this is, here's sort of what I extracted from some of the literature that I've been thinking about, or just my own thoughts. Here's some of the classical norms of personhood as they've been delivered to us maybe just in folk psychology, but also maybe by the intellectual traditions that we live in. And some you'll see are Platonic, some are Aristotelian, some are Lockean, and some of the ones I'll get to at the end are pretty far from those. So here's some classical norms of personhood. There's 13 norms I think I have on here. First one is sort of a Socratic norm, know thyself. Okay, and this is the epistemic. This sort of channels one of the epistemic ideas. The idea is that it's better to know yourself than not know yourself. There's nothing. Second one, speak truthfully about yourself. Speak truthfully about yourself. This could be in soliloquy or in public, but the idea is that it's related to the know thyself, but the idea is that if you're in interpersonal relationships, then tell the truth about yourself. Be true to yourself. This is an interesting one that has to do with being in time, right? The idea is that whether you set a blueprint and a life plan, or a 5-year plan, or you're just doing improv, sort of stay for whatever the temporal period is in the vicinity of developing the theme, okay, for now, something like that. Take responsibility for yourself. Now, Locke himself says that the concept of person is a forensic concept. He actually distinguishes it from the concept of what he calls man, which is exactly the one, what's important for medical doctors, right? For Locke, the same man is just the same biological organism. So Granny is still the same man till she dies, even if she's mentally not the same person because she can no longer appropriate her past self. So losing narrative ability for Locke is losing personhood. It's not losing manhood. And Locke, as I said, says it's a forensic concept. It's a concept that we use to assign blame and responsibility, okay, to ourselves and to other people. Now the fifth one here, I think, is, as I say in the paper, a more modern one than, it's a modern one and it may be only suited for our kind of world. It's this: make something interesting and worthwhile of yourself. Make something interesting and worthwhile of yourself. Then there are demands, what I call demands of narrativity. Be prepared to tell the story of your life. You might think this is just this is already embedded in what was said before, but that's okay, because we're trying to sort of piece together and unfold what are the expectations that we have as social animals, gregarious social animals, for what we're supposed to be able to do with ourselves. One, I think, is one that is to hook the narrative. And we expect people to hook the narratives in ways that involve sort of culturally well-known scenarios. So for example, actually you might say there's things like the St. Paul on the road to Damascus conversion experience. That's one way you could do it. There's Darwinian ways: slow it down, tell me very gradually how you unfold it. Here's a passage that I love from Lolita. Nabokov gives this example. We're probably doing this now with Mad Men and Breaking Bad and Downton Abbey, but listen to this. Never in my life, this is where Humbert explains why he and Charlotte are on the outs. Never in my life had I confessed so much or received so many confessions. The sincerity and artlessness with which she discussed her love life, from first necking to connubial catch as catch can, were ethically in stark contrast with my glib compositions. But technically the two sets were congeneric, since both were affected by the same stuff: soap operas, psychoanalysis, and cheap novelettes. Upon which I drew for my characters, and she for her mode of expression. She showed fierce, insatiable curiosity for my past. She made me tell her about all about my marriage to Valeria, who was, of course, a scream. But I also had to invent, or to pad atrociously, a long series of mistresses for Charlotte's morbid delectation. So I presented my women and had them smile and sway, the languorous blonde, the fiery brunette, the sensual copperhead, as if on parade in a bordello. The more popular and platitudinous I made them, the more Mrs. Humbert was pleased with the show. This is the sort of narrative hooking idea, and I think it's so hard to see sometimes because, of course, the narrative hooks are things that we wear like glasses. We see the world through them and we apply them to the world, but they're there all the time. And the genres differ. We heard about, sort of there's neuro-imperialism now, so everybody's supposed to talk about neuro something whenever they talk about anything else. That's an interesting sort of change in things. And people, instead of talking about their anger or their fear, they talk about their amygdala. It's just peculiar. It's very peculiar when you think about neurospeak. It's just because it's in the minds of people who don't know what they're talking about at all. And not only are they often mistaken, they just say things about things they obviously are not in any first personal touch with to describe their experiences. In any case, here are some other demands. And these are demands, and I think everything I say here shows that these are ideals or demands or recognitions. They're quite compatible with all we've heard about the psychological difficulties of telling accurate stories about ourselves. So here's 9 through 13. The narrative is responsible or tracks the important facts. It tracks what really matters. That's a sort of Harry Frankfurt idea. And maybe, I mean, here when we say the important facts, you know, you should know where you went to high school, you should know who the loves of your life are, you should know where you went to college and things like that. But you don't need to know what you had for breakfast last Saturday morning. And so these are, of course, themselves normatively determined, okay, by communities and by individuals. The narrative is open-ended epistemically. At least it's epistemically open-ended. Now, it might involve a blueprint, or it might involve a 5-year plan, but it's still open-ended because you don't know whether you're going to succeed at doing it, right? So it's open-ended epistemically. You don't know how things will work out. And we hear people say this all the time. This is an example I have in the quotes here. I planned for a career in architecture, but then I was drafted, work as a medic, and decided to go to med school. Okay, so we allow principled or rational, these are not quite improvs, because they're about important, well, maybe they are improvs, I don't know. But the direction of the narrative, 11, is the future is structured and constrained by antecedent intentions, plans, and projects. So people do say things like, I will always be there for my children. And people take marriage vows. And they don't take them like liberal ironists. If you were a liberal ironist and said, I promise to have and to hold from this day forward, you would mean something like, I don't know what you would mean. You would mean something like, I kind of intend, and this is a nice ceremony we're having, isn't it, sweetie? Something like that. Because promises, you know, are no longer promises. Like a promise is, it's said in non-ironically, is a promise. But there are ironists who, well, maybe we'll come back to that. The narrative, this is, to me, a fascinating feature of narratives. It's filled with post facto revisings and reinterpretations. I mean, so Thomas and I were talking about this yesterday. People who say, like, you know, you meet up with a friend who you saw 15 years ago and you say, how are you? He says, I'm fine, I'm with so-and-so, we're wonderful. He said, oh, that's good because you got over Janie. And the person says, Janie, I never loved her anyway. Okay, this is a familiar, but it's perplexing. It's perplexing whether the people are just confused, whether they've changed their standards of love and affection and things like that, or whether they forgot, or whether there's something else going on. It's very interesting, but we permit ourselves these kind of post facto revisitations and changing the past. And sometimes there's probably self-deception, other times there might just not be. It's just interesting. And then there are things like narrative completeness up until now. I can, barring dementia, tell or write the story of my life as if from the very beginning to the present. And again, not everything that I did, but everything, the events that matter. Now, so then I list down here underneath it some consensus facts among people I call performative theorists, but I just made that expression up. And I'm a philosopher after all, I do things from the armchair. But what I wanted to say, and let me just, because I don't want to, the audience participation sections have been the most profitable part of this, these meetings to me. What I just want to say is this. I just think there's something interesting and plausible about this way of thinking about us as narrative creatures as a kind of a general descriptive, talking about a set of practices and norms we have. But I want to be, I talk it late in my paper about some new models or new genres of being a person. I don't know how new they are, but they're recent. So for example, there is the model that I get from Richard Rorty, where Rorty talks about that in a post-Lockean world, he doesn't put it this way, but in a world that's lost that sort of metaphysical structure where there's certainty about what the right rules are for your moral, your epistemic, and aesthetic life, we what he calls liberal ironists are people who, and there's quotes on the page, are people who don't any longer have deep confidence about the form of life that they're living in accordance with. They don't have confidence, for example, if they're living aesthetically in the aesthetic norms. They might just think, well, I'm being clever, and someone might say to them, so what good is it being clever? You say, well, it's a good question, I don't really know, but I'm just doing it, I'm just being clever. I'm trying to be interesting. What good is there to being interesting? I'm not sure. There's no longer an answer sub specie aeternitatis. There was an answer traditionally to cleverness or interestingness, it's that they're not that important. But once you lose the metaphysical structure, okay, that says they're not that important, well, then you might just say it's up to the individual. Different strokes for different folks, or whatever. The same thing with the moral structure of the universe. It's no longer clear once one loses the metaphysical teleological structure what exactly the right moral rules are, or the right way to be as a moral agent. At least it's not obvious how one goes about justifying it. And of course, this is where we get people like ironic persons who find, and I appreciate this, that there's joy to be had for being playful in life, for having fun, for doing things that are interesting. But as Galen will say in person, his past selves just feel very remote to him. And this is an idea that Derek Parfit has also pushed, and I appreciate it to a certain point. His idea is that I feel more related, qua person, to Wilson right now than I feel to my 16-year-old self. And that's not because I was embarrassed by my 16-year-old self, which I was. Okay? But here I am, a being in time connected to this guy. Okay? That person is just remote. He's gone. He's gone forever. And the guy that I'll be when I die, he's another guy too. So once you get away from the idea that a person, or what defines your personhood, is the diamond in the rough that is you, that is there from the start and that is there until you end, and think of a person as something like a process, then your attitudes about who is there at all the different times in your life can change dramatically. So the only point that I make in the paper, I think, that is normative, is that I do think that, going back to my Platonic instincts, it would be nice if a life involved a life of living in the vicinity of what's true, what's good, and what's beautiful. Now the project is to figure out what are the right norms for each of those things. I have a sense, or a gut reaction, that I know kind of what the good is, but it's kind of an old-fashioned sense, so maybe it's just holding on to this old kind of metaphysical teleological structure. A worry about some of the modern selves that I see paraded under the performative conception is that they are too much the aesthete model. They're too focused on aesthetic values. Okay, and we'll hear more from Elijah about this in the case of Oscar Wilde. For not as much on truth and goodness. So that is a possible way to criticize lives. It has to do with a different kind of unity than narrative unity. It's just to say, if the best human lives are lived at the intersection of what's true, what's good, and beautiful, then knowing yourself really well, having an accurate self-conception, and being a good person, these will be good things. Now, just to conclude, there is a literature, as Dan Schachter mentioned yesterday, in Epistemology 101 we teach it's always wrong to have false beliefs. And in Psychology 101, you're taught, if you want to be happy for the rest of your life, have a lot of false beliefs, especially about yourself. And the alternative is called depressive realism. I started writing about this in the early 90s. I was very worried about this because it rubs the philosopher the wrong way, because it just can't be, damn it, that well-being and knowing the truth are in tension. But it looks that way because the research consistently finds that the only people who have really good, accurate conceptions of themselves are moderately depressed. So this is disturbing. And that would make you worry about, this is in the book by Shelley Taylor, Positive Illusions, but it's in a famous paper that she and Jonathan Brown did in Psychological Review a few years before that. And it's pretty consistent finding that this is the case. So it worries me. Maybe we just actually, the Platonic ideal is just an ideal, and that best of all possible worlds that I imagine where these three things intersect is not in the cards for us. So thank you very much.